Justin, it's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Can you share a time when you changed a long-held belief and what influenced that change?
When I was younger, I was more of a political libertarian. This is a view that holds that the activities of the government are difficult to justify and should be fairly minimal in scope, and that people should be largely free from government interference in their activities and from taxation. I no longer hold that position. And one of the things that actually got me to change my mind about that was studying the view. So I thought I was a defender of it, thought I was going to defend it. I'd written some stuff in defense of it and realized that over time the arguments weren't compelling for it, and there were some significant arguments against it. So I was just learning a lot about the view. The more I studied it, the more I realized, well, this is hard to justify.
And was there anything that led you into that position in the first place?
Well, I think that I had some friends who were interested in political philosophy, who I spent a fair amount of time with, who introduced me some ideas there. And some of the initial arguments I came across were pretty, at the time, compelling. It was just I thought some of these arguments worked. I thought that I found the authors convincing. And it was just a matter of reading more about it, thinking through a bit more, reading more criticisms, that I came to have a different view. I think that's often how it works. I'm in philosophy, and a lot of times when you initially read philosophy, especially when you're first getting into philosophy, you're reading the words of authors who are trying to convince you of something using logic and reason to the best of their ability. And if they've been doing it a long time, they're reading this book and you haven't been doing it as long, they're probably better at it than you are. And so you might find yourself pretty well convinced by what they're saying. It might take you a while to think through things, it may take you some time to encounter opposing arguments to finally come to learn, oh, well, this thing that I thought was compelling at first, not so much later on.
Are there any beliefs you feel you will never abandon and why?
Well, I guess in principle, I want to say no. I don't think that there's nothing that I say I'll never give up. There are some views I have that I'm pretty skeptical I'd give up. I don't think I'll ever think that there's something like a personal God, that is a deity that has an interest in the lives of humans and plays a role in the lives of humans. I think it would be very difficult to convince me of something like that. But I know plenty of intelligent people who are theists and have those kinds of views. So I don't even say that I'll never come to that view. Just that I've thought about that issue a bit, looked at the arguments quite a lot. Nothing has really convinced me that that could be the case so far.
What does it mean to disagree well?
Well, to disagree well, I think you first want to recognize a situation in which it's possible to disagree well. And that first might be to look at a situation where intellectual humility is called for. So try to identify that. So you might have a strongly held view, and you might be in disagreement with someone else who has a strongly held view, and you might be pretty convinced of your view, but you might think, is this a situation in which there's a lot going on in the view? There's lots of open questions, there's lots of moving parts in the view, there's lots of facts that need to be in place to support my view. When there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of elements, a lot of complications, and a lot of questions that need to be answered in order for you to have your view, despite your confidence in it, I think that's an opportunity for you to say, oh, maybe some intellectual humility is called for. And when you have an attitude of intellectual humility, it's one in which you recognize that you might be mistaken. And I think just even that mere recognition of the idea that you might be mistaken can inform how you interact with those with whom you disagree. You can approach them in a less certain manner, in a more open and questioning manner. And I think that's kind of a first step, is just sort of recognizing, hey, this is a situation in which intellectual humility might apply. Let it inform me. I think a second step would be to assume that the people with whom you're disagreeing are arguing in good faith or disagreeing in good faith. I don't think I'm an evil person. I don't think my friends who might agree with me on a particular topic are evil people. I don't think there's anything particularly special about me and my friends in that regard. So probably the people I'm disagreeing with are not evil. So I shouldn't assume that in my dealings with them. They probably have, from their own point of view, a very reasonable account of why they have the position they do. And they certainly don't think that it's wrong or evil for them to have that view. So I shouldn't assume they're bad people. I think that's another part. And then in order to make progress, perhaps with the disagreement, would be to try to identify elements on which you do agree with the people that you disagree with. So there might be some topic or some question over which you disagree, but it turns out if you take a few steps back in the inquiry, there might be something you can agree on, and then you can sort of figure out, oh, our disagreement turns on a difference of opinion on this particular question, or whether we think this particular fact is true. But then, I mean, I'd say like the last part, it would be like sometimes you just have to be okay with disagreeing and not let it bother you. And many contexts were like this. So you might have your favorite movies. I might have my favorite movies. We might disagree over that, but it doesn't really bother me that you like certain movies that I don't, or that I like certain movies that you don't. That's just a disagreement that we can live with. It may be that more of the disagreements that we have, we should see in this light of disagreements that we're okay with, that don't bother us, that we're fine that other people have a difference of opinion.
What do you think the difference is between these disagreements that we can be okay with, not really acknowledging, and the other disagreements where it might be a bit more important to debate and talk about?
I think one difference would be where practical action on our parts is required. Like we need to decide something together, or we need to there needs to be a decision made over something that will affect both of us, and we might prefer one way and they might prefer another. So in those situations, it can be difficult to be okay with disagreement if it's going to affect me or someone I care about or some topic I care about in an important way. So I think there are some kinds of differences, but I do think there's some things we can do to make the topics over which we might feel more strongly about the importance of our disagreement, maybe just to tone down our concern about that disagreement a little bit. And that's just to sort of appreciate a couple of things. One, the history of humanity is the history of mistakes. And so we could be wrong, they could be wrong, and we might find that out later. But despite the history of humanity being the history of mistakes, humans are doing pretty well. This is not to say that there isn't horrible suffering and evil in the world. There is. On balance, for many people in the world, humans are doing much better than they have in the past, despite mistakes in the past, despite disagreements. And some appreciation about our position in the history of humanity and how good life is for many of us might make us somewhat less concerned about some of these topics over which we disagree, even when the disagreement is about something we have to do together or that might affect us.
Do you think there are any benefits to disagreement alone? And maybe even that disagreement is underappreciated?
Absolutely. I mean, disagreement is a way in which knowledge is produced. If I have a thought about something and someone else has a thought about something, we have to put our ideas together, come up with the best versions of our argument, the best evidence for our argument, test them against one another, and see see which position comes out stronger if we can. It's often through the presenting of one set of ideas against another that we make progress in figuring out what to think, what to believe, and how to live. So I think absolutely disagreement is something that we should value. I mean, another thing is that disagreement is a pretty effective way of having human conflict without a lot of the downsides of human conflict. So like fighting, physical fighting, that's downside, right? That involve injury. In war, that's a physical conflict, obviously, that cause lots of destruction. Humans might have a need to have some kinds of agonistic conflictual relations. Disagreement is a pretty good way of satisfying that need in a hopefully peaceable way.
As the editor of the Daily News, how do you prevent or handle heated conflicts within online communities?
It can be challenging, even among my audience, which is largely composed of philosophers and philosophy students who specialize in argument and who disagree as a form of livelihood with one another. There can be heated debates and people can misbehave. I've tried many methods over the years in terms of moderating the comments and conversations that happen on the website, and it's not clear what the best solution is. A lot of times anonymity will lead to people behaving badly because they feel like they can escape the consequences of what they say. And so they might not be on their best argumentative behavior. They might be overly snarky, sarcastic, or take cheap shots. On the other hand, sometimes it's important to allow anonymity in comments because some people feel that they're in vulnerable positions. And if they want to say something that might be critical of those who they feel vulnerable to, the protection of an anonymity encourage them, embolden them to speak up. And so it's very challenging. I sometimes will personally write back commenters and say, hey, I'd like to publish this comment, but can I eliminate this sentence? It seems like it's going to cause a lot of trouble. And sometimes they're open to that, and sometimes they're not. I do what I can.
Do you think this applies to schools and universities as well? And how they can promote good disagreement?
Well, I think schools and universities can best promote disagreement through their primary mission, which is education, and just sort of focusing on certain aspects of education. As I said before, I think that it's important to learn that history is full of mistakes, and not just mistakes when it comes to moral questions or political questions or matters that people might think it's reasonable to have lots of disagreement over, but the history of science, for example, is the history of mistakes, even recent science. And when we learn that, I think it hopefully helps us adopt more of a position of intellectual humility. And then downstream from that attitude of intellectual humility, more open-mindedness, more curiosity, more reasonableness when it comes to confronting those when we disagree.